elaborate for us tonight on the rebirth of this wisdom in Western culture in the 15th century and how mathematical mysticism became important to modern science. So over to you, Bernie.
Thank you very much, Spez, and thank you to the Greek community of Melbourne for inviting me here tonight. And I especially want to thank Nick Dallas and Helen and John Vlahos, and to all the members of the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne who are also members of our academy, and there's a lot of them. My name is Bernie Lewin, and I'm from the Platonic Academy of Melbourne. We run evening classes in philosophy, especially Plato and Platonism. Our classes have just started this week. It's not too late to join in. And so let's get started. How did the Renaissance begin? How did modern science begin? These are big questions about the foundation of the modern world. The Renaissance. So we have this revival of art and science in Italy in the 15th century, especially in Florence. It started in Florence, spread to the other city-states in Italy, and then over the Alps to France and to the Rhinelands, and eventually over to funny old England. What sparked this marvellous explosion of culture? What caused this turn towards art and science, towards novelty, towards technology, a momentum that has never stopped to this day? Of course, as with many historical questions, it's hard to find one prevailing cause. So let's not do that tonight. But we can at least trace how it happened, the order of events, and what seemed important. That's all we'll do tonight. But in doing this, I want to emphasize the contribution of theologians coming from the East, from the Eastern Empire, coming west with delegations trying to win support for Constantinople's losing battle against the Ottoman Turk. This reception of Eastern Church scholars was at the very beginning, at the very essence of the Renaissance. But this part of the origin story of the Renaissance is less appreciated these days. Especially missed is just how important were these Eastern scholars to the beginning of modern science. After all, they weren't scientists, not in the modern sense. They were priests and theologians, hardly your image of a proto-modern scientist. Yes, they were Orthodox theologians, but they were also Platonic philosophers, some of them anyway. They taught Christian Platonic mysticism, and one key player, Gemistos Platon, even let go of the Christian bit. He taught Platonic philosophy in all its pre-Christian glory. But what could such religious mysticism, Christian or otherwise, have to do with the birth of modern science? Modern atheistic science that must have come from somewhere else. Is that right? Yeah, sorry, we just lost the screen there. Maybe, is it my computer? I'll just flick it around a bit, yeah. Okay, so modern atheistic science, it must have come from somewhere else, right? Not from kind of these mystics. But it didn't. Modern science, at least modern mathematical science, had its birth here with the reception of these theological advisors, these Platonists, mystics from the East. That is what I want to explain tonight. And it's a privilege to tell this story of the essential role played by these Greek scholars, a privilege to tell this story to such an audience as this, the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne. You of another Greek diaspora who have contributed cultural richness at another time in Melbourne today. So thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share this story with you. And so, let's begin. What caused the Renaissance? Money. Let's start with that. Free-flowing money, gold florins, lots of them, facilitating trade, building wealth. That was a foundation, the precondition for the Renaissance. Cosimo de' Medici, you might have heard of him. And he seems to be at the centre of things, right? The Medici, that hugely wealthy banking family with Giovanni at the head, and then after him his son Cosimo, and later there was Cosimo's grandson. You might have heard of Lorenzo de' Medici. Across the 15th century and beyond, the Medici had marvellous wealth and power in the richest city in Italy, Florence, that city of traders. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank in Florence right at the end of the 14th century. And by the time Cosimo had finished his education, his classical education, we'll come to that. The Medici banking family practically ran the place. And beyond, they were bankers to the Pope. They had debtors among the most powerful houses in medieval Europe. So the Medici had money. And they also had a certain freedom. It seemed important that this patronage was not ecclesiastical, not of the church, and not of the state either, at least in the old-fashioned sense. These Medici were trumped-up burghers, moneylenders. This business power detached from traditional state church power seems to have afforded the Medici a certain freedom. And so they had this freedom to use their money, and they used a significant portion of their money to support the revival of ancient arts and knowledge and wisdom. The art and culture that had declined 1,000 years earlier and remained derelict, like the architectural ruins all around them, neglected, derelict, and then they turned it around. By the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century, some of the revived sciences had already advanced beyond what the ancients had achieved. In this Renaissance, in this rebirth of ancient cultural glory, the Medici looked back not only on old Italy, not only on the greatness of the Roman Empire. Others did that. Other humanists, as we call them, sought out the Latin text, forgotten, rotting, neglected in Western monastic libraries. But this was not the main interest of the Medici, and this was not their important contribution. The Medici looked beyond Rome, even as the old Roman literati did, even as their beloved Cicero did. They looked towards the glories of ancient Greece. This was not to Aristotle, whose philosophy had already been assimilated in a corralled, stifling dogma during the High Middle Ages. Not Aristotle, but Plato and the Platonists. and the fabled text exalted by Latins like Cicero were not even hidden somewhere in Western libraries. Most of them were entirely lost to the Western scholars, and lost also was the language to read them. And even when they had some crude and partial translations or summaries, these were difficult to understand. Western scholars needed teachers to induct them back into the Platonic approach to philosophy and science. Cosimo was one of the first to receive the benefits of the Byzantine theologians arriving in Florence. His youthful induction into Platonism led him to become the great advocate and patron of the Platonic revival. Then there was the young Lorenzo, Cosimo's grandson, who was inducted from a very early age. As a boy, he was tutored by Marsilio Ficino, the very scholar Cosimo had commissioned to translate the complete works of Plato. Lorenzo's tutor, Ficino, was the founder of the Platonic Academy of Florence. Lorenzo was trained in Platonism, but he was also trained in the very language of Plato. This was by one John Argyropoulos of Constantinople. So what was he doing in Florence? He had come to Florence as a theological advisor to the Ecumenical Council of Florence. The ecumenical councils of this time, this was in the 1430s and 1440s, they were, well, let's be frank, politically they were anxious attempts to win support for the Eastern Empire that was crumbling slowly under the onslaught of the Ottoman Turks. From the late 1300s, there had been repeated requests for military support. And then there was this idea, like, hey, maybe we should bury our differences. Maybe this is a good time for the church, East and West, to reunite. A united Christendom against the terror of the Mohammedan heresy. The first embassies arrived in the trade port of Venice. Later they would come directly to the Ecumenical Council in Florence. And think, if you're going to negotiate a doctrinal, a theological union, what sort of expert do you need to bring with you? Theologians, of course. And this is why they were there in Florence. But the thing is, some of them were also Platonists, including this Argyropoulos, Lorenzo's tutor. He was one of them. Other scholars came too, and they brought manuscripts of the ancient classics, the stuff of legends long heard of but never seen, complete and in beautiful condition. And these theologian Platonists also brought with them, of course, the native-born knowledge of the language, the knowledge too of what these texts were talking about. How important were these Byzantine influences on the Renaissance? The Byzantine influence on the Renaissance is part of an old romantic story of the origin of the Renaissance. You might have heard of this one. This was where the Renaissance was all about the revival of Greek wisdom, essentially Platonism, and this revival was sparked by transmission from the Eastern Empire, even as it was on the verge of collapse. You might know the story of how scholars and text ventured westwards to escape the Ottoman Turk before and upon the sack of Constantinople in 1453. The sack of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of a great continuous cultural tradition, the Eastern Roman Empire. A tradition continuous back to Constantine the Great, the emperor convert to Christianity, and continuous back to the Hellenistic world, instigated by the conquest of Alexander the Great. In the Hellenistic world, philosophy and wisdom thrived, and most especially the philosophy, the wisdom of Plato. And so the sack of Constantinople in 1453 marked the end of a cultural tradition seen continuous back to Plato's Athens 2,000 years earlier in the 4th century BC. But, so this story goes, all was not lost in 1453. The great treasures of learning travelled westward into Italy, to Florence, and sparked the Renaissance. Have you heard this story? This romantic origin story of the Renaissance, of the origin of modern Europe. Well, you know what? It's true. To some extent, this is indeed how it happened. Today I want to show you just how important to the Renaissance was the influence coming westward from the Eastern Empire. I want to show you how important was this Platonism, this mysticism, this religious Platonism, how critical it was at least to one important aspect of the Renaissance. That is its importance to the emergence of Renaissance science, Renaissance mathematical science. The science that has shaped our modern world and continues to do so. Now, mathematical science, what do I mean? Geometry and arithmetic, of course, but also those sciences that are now expressed in mathematical form. Astronomy first, physics, modern chemistry, and increasingly biology, and now, of course, cybernetics and computer science. The mathematical sciences emerged slowly in the 15th and 16th centuries, but as they did, they began to shape the modern world. More and more, our understanding of nature, of technology, is reduced to the formal principles of geometry and arithmetic. It's like you've got to make the mathematical equations work before you can call it science. Before it's astronomy, before it's physics, chemistry, before it can be applied to architecture and engineering. In my view, the influence of Byzantine Platonism on this renaissance of the mathematical science was absolutely fundamental because of the way Platonism saw mathematics as fundamental to our understanding of experience. Indeed, fundamental to the reality of our sensual world. Once you see how this philosophical view, this theological view works to motivate science, then it's easy to see just how important were these Platonist scholars arriving with the delegations from the East. Alas, these days, this understanding of Renaissance science with the critical role played by these scholars is often missed or at least undervalued, and especially in the popular discourse. There's an alternative view that prevails. So what is this view? In this alternative view, the emergence of modern science was not about pseudo-Christian mysticism promoted by theologians. No, Modern science began in direct opposition to that. Modern science only arose through breaking away from religious modes. It was reason against religion. It was logical accounts of nature in itself against religious myths of divine creation, of divine intervention. The object of science must be released from the object of devotion for it to advance. In this view, science emerged atheistic, logical, materialistic. This is science as a study of nature in itself as an object of science, not nature as created by a divine creator. Science is about causation that starts and ends in the visible, in the sensible, what you can see and feel. Empirical science about the material world out there. Science is not about unseen mystical causes. This alternative view of science and of how it emerged historically is the view of what we now call the Enlightenment. This so-called Enlightenment began in Britain and spread to France and Germany in the 18th century. In the 18th century. That's 300 or 400 years after the Renaissance began. The Enlightenment began at least 300 years after we saw the revival of the mathematical sciences. And yet there's this tendency to forget that. To fudge the history as though what happened in the Renaissance was only a proto-Enlightenment. Actually, this depiction of science did not even fit well the great science of the time, like the great advances in mathematics at the time, and not Isaac Newton's mathematical mechanics or astronomy. But that did not seem to matter. We're not going to go into that. Only what is important for us here is that the narrative of atheistic materialistic science tends to overwhelm the story of the emergence of modern science during the Renaissance. Renaissance science had a completely different mindset. Even the most cursory view of Renaissance science reveals that it did not fit this Enlightenment narrative. And so what happens again and again is that we get this unconscious fuzzing of history where the Enlightenment view is stretched back over the previous 300 years or more. So that the Renaissance science, in the Renaissance, where undeniably modern science began, where what is important in the Renaissance is only about how it is proto-Enlightenment, proto-atheistic, proto-materialistic. Now, the latest version of this history is a popular recent book by a famous Harvard professor. You might have seen it in bookshops. The book is called The Swerve, How the Renaissance Began. How the Renaissance began, according to this author, Stephen Greenblatt, is that if it began anywhere, he says, then it began with the discovery of a Latin text in Germany in 1417. De Rerum Natura, The Nature of Things, is a long poem by Latin poem by Lucretius from around the time of Christ. It celebrates a late version of Epicurean philosophy, a philosophy that is materialistic, a material atomism, and atheistic, a rejection of divine and mystical causes for pure material causes. There's no creator, not even creation. The world always existed as lots of tiny material atoms randomly bumping into each other and clumping together. That's it. That's what nature is. And according to Greenblatt, that is the modern view. Is it really the modern view? We won't go into that. But anyway, according to Greenblatt, this was also the Renaissance view. This view of nature presented by Lucretius was taken up by Leonardo da Vinci, by Botticelli, and the early Renaissance scientists like Giordano Bruno. Really? Look, for anyone who has read an account of science by scientists from the Renaissance, Greenblatt's claim of the influence of Lucretius is tenuous, with tenuous evidence, and you have to turn a blind eye to so much plain evidence in the other direction. I don't want to go into that, but only reflect why this view has not been laughed out of consideration. This view of how the Renaissance began was a huge success, a bestseller, rave reviews. And folks who know my interest in science say you've got to read this great history. Why are we so credulous to such stories, where the revival of atheistic materialist science marks the origin of modern science? I suggest that we can explain our credulity to such fantastic depiction of history because the Enlightenment narrative of science remains dominant. And it's like how we grew up, how many of us grew up. Church on Sunday, science in school during the week. Two separate domains of knowledge. The science at school had no theology of the Creator, and while there may have been famous conflict between these two domains, every attempt would be made to save science, and then later to save religion, by keeping the two domains separate. This separation of the domains of science from religion actually goes back to medieval times, to medieval scholasticism, when science, Aristotelian science, was introduced in the Middle Ages alongside religious dogma. There was revealed religion about God, revealed in the Bible, and then there was the analysis of the created creatures in the mode of Aristotle. But after the Middle Ages, there was the Renaissance. This Renaissance transformed the view of science. Science and religion came together. They came together again in the mode of Plato. In the Renaissance, to practice science was to venture closer to the divine. So how did this work? In the Renaissance, to practice science was an extension of your devotion, a religious practice. Science was a study of creation to investigate the modes of creation by the Creator. It was an extension of theology, of contemplation of the divine, of contemplation of the Creator. And we see this in the late 15th century with the likes of Leonardo da Vinci and early Renaissance geometers. Consider Leonardo. He illustrated a famous book about geometry, especially about what we now call the golden ratio. Only that they didn't call it the golden ratio back then. They called it divine, the divine proportion. This book that was published in 1509 identifies the divine proportion with the Creator God, who expressed his triune nature in a unity in three terms. Oh, there we go. The geometric symmetry of the world is the symmetry of its Creator. So it began from the late 15th century to the beginning of the 18th century. Across 300 years, one finds that there prevailed this very different attitude and motive to the practice of science. And this is what motivated science. This is what got science going in the first 300 years. There's not enough time to survey the scope and character of the Renaissance science, only to give a flavour of it. And I can give you a bit of a flavour by quoting a famous quote of Galileo that you might have heard of before, where he uses this familiar metaphor of the time of nature as a book. Sure, we can find God in the great book, in the Bible, but there's another grand book open to our gaze, the book of nature. Galileo. Philosophy is written in this grand book. I mean the universe which stands open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering about in a dark labyrinth. And around the same time of Galileo, there was Johannes Kepler, who advanced Copernican astronomy with his new mathematics of elliptical orbits. In the mode of the most devout Platonist, you should read him, Kepler unlocked the key mathematical principles of astrophysics for Newton to then take up. As for Newton, he was no explicit Platonist, and yet the Renaissance attitude to science remained with him and his peers. His magnum opus was called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Its first two books outlined these mathematical principles of nature before presenting in the third book how these mathematical principles are expressed in the systems of the world. In the system of the world, in the solar system with the sun at the centre. After it was published, his scientist friend Edmund Halley, Halley's Comet, celebrated Newton's genius in a famous ode to Newton, which ends like this: "For he, Newton, unlocked the hidden treasures of truth, so richly through his mind has Phoebus, Apollo, cast the radiance of his own divinity. Nearer the gods no mortal may approach." That is, to unlock the mathematical mysteries of the solar system, to unlock the hidden treasures of truth, and he does is to unlock the hidden treasures of truth, and he does this. He that does this becomes radiantly divine. Newton was on the cusp of the Enlightenment when such an attitude to science was becoming dangerously heretical. Up until Newton, in the Renaissance, science was not atheistic, but thoroughly theistic. It was only that the prevailing theology was Platonic. And Platonic theology is formal, mathematical, and mystical. All these went together: formal, mathematical, mystical. Mystical, mysticism, and science. We normally consider these two separate modes of thought, right? Like the mystic in the monastery, in the cave, in the ashram. A world away from the scientist in the lab, right? Not for the Platonists, old and new. Consider mathematics for a moment. What is it? Where is it? Where does it exist? I can draw a circle with a pencil on the page. But what is this circle that I'm depicting in pencil? What is the circle that all circular things express? It's like I have the idea of the circle and I draw it, but the idea of the circle is not in my senses. I recognize circles in things, in wheels, in plates, in cups, in cogs, in circular things. But where is the circle itself? It's like an idea. It's ideal. And the ideal is not visible, not sensible at all, but yet real. According to the Platonists, the highest reality contains these unseen and so mystical forms. So all geometry is unseen, and so too arithmetic. Consider number. 2 + 2 is 4, always. All these numbers represented by numerals in your mathematical book, in your physics books, those equations, where do they exist? Can you touch them? Can you see them? No. They're ideal. The universal, timeless ratios, the mathematical principles behind every law of physics are ideal, mystical. The whole of mathematics is in this state. For the Pythagoreans before Plato, and then for Plato and the Platonists, the mathematical is unseen, insensible, beyond time and place, beyond any particular time and place, and yet very real and present. This reality is divine, mystical. I can't see it, and yet it is the form of all creation. All creation expresses the principles of mathematics because it is by these principles that the natural world was created. To understand nature is to find the underlying laws of its creation, the laws by which it was created and continues to be created. And so to do science is to become closer to the divine, even to become divine, to become radiantly divine yourself. This is the drive, the motive of Platonic science. And those people in the academy who have read some of Plato know that this is what Platonic science is all about. Coming closer to God through the mathematical forms. This drove science, this motivated science. Through studying nature, one comes to understand its form, its ideal mathematical form, and this is how you find God in nature and therefore ascend to divinity. Ascend to divinity. Renaissance humanism professed this ascent, this Platonic ascent. We first see it in Plato. We humans are only halfway between the animal and the divine, but through our intellect, we can and should aspire to divinity. It is in this attitude that Renaissance mathematical sciences began, and for 300 or 400 years, this attitude prevailed in science, which was enough time for it to advance, even in the face of persecution. It was enough time for it to advance so that we could see, by the 18th century, its clear, practical purpose. As for these Renaissance practitioners of early modern science, they saw no contradiction with Christianity. They held a view that goes back to the early Greek church fathers, that all true wisdom is Christian. Therefore, Christianity predates Jesus, even that it predates Moses, that Christianity is as old as creation. For the Platonists, this was easy to accept. The early church was infused with Platonism. Church fathers from Origen to St. Augustine saw no contradiction. Indeed, that the teachings of the Jesus Christ only added to the teachings of Plato. And so this is the link. No, this is the seamless continuity between mysticism and science for the Platonists, a seamless continuity through mathematics. This is often missed by modern accounts. And this is why these Platonic mystics, these funny-looking theologians coming from the East, were so important to Renaissance science in the West. So, I want to finish tonight just by giving you a bit of an outline chronology of the transmission of Platonism into Western Europe. It's not well known, it's not well talked about, but it's a fascinating story. And I start right back in the beginning, in the 5th century BC. The ancient mathematical mysticism that was revived in the West seems to have begun among the followers of Pythagoras in the 5th century BC. It was taken up by Plato, and we see this especially in the esoteric research and teachings of his academy. Secret teachings in the academy. Much of the early work is lost, but the intense mathematical research that was undertaken by these mathematicians in and around Plato's academy is preserved in later works, including Euclid's Elements of Geometry, written a few decades after Plato's death, a book that amazingly remained a school text until recent times. The philosophical foundations of this mathematical approach to science have survived not only in Plato's dialogues, but also in the works of the so-called Neoplatonists, especially Proclus, who was the head of the revived Platonic Academy in the 4th century after Christ. Proclus wrote commentaries on Plato, he systemized Platonic formal philosophy, and he wrote commentaries on mathematics, on Euclid's geometry. Beyond pure mathematics, there was also ancient research into mathematical physics, preserved for us in the works of Archimedes. Ancient mathematical astronomy we know from the work of Ptolemy from the 2nd century AD. Platonic science thrived through the Hellenistic period into the early Christian period. Remember, for example, that Proclus was in the 4th century. He was after Emperor Constantine set Christianity as the favoured religion of the empire. It was not until early in the 6th century that the philosophy schools were forced to close, and so their teaching and research ceased. But anyway, in the West, the Western Roman Empire was collapsing, and this brought on the so-called Dark Ages. Much later, in the High Middle Ages, in the 11th and 12th century, the revival of Aristotle was carefully corralled so that not to touch Christian theology. That's where you got the separation of science from religion. And it arrived in the West mostly through translations of Arabic translations of translations, sometimes 3 times. But there was one terrible event in the early 13th century that afforded Western scholars direct communication with the Eastern Empire. The Fourth Crusade, which turned to sack of Constantinople, which brought on the so-called Latin Empire. This is how we got William of Morebecky's direct translations, which included works of the Neoplatonist Proclus. At the end of the next century, the 14th century, this is when we come to the beginning of the Renaissance revival. The Florentine revival. The Florentine revival began in Venice in the 1390s, when an embassy arrived from the east pleading for Western support against the Turks. This embassy included Manuel Chrysoloras. Chrysoloras met Italian scholars curious about ancient Greek learning, including the Chancellor of Florence, who invited him to Florence to teach Greek. Such a profoundly significant invitation. Chrysoloras taught Greek to many who would become important in the revival. He produced a Greek grammar that would be widely used in decades to come. And he translated Plato's Republic into Latin. But his most important influence was indirect to Cosimo de' Medici, mostly via Cosimo's tutor, Roberto de' Rossi, one of Chrysoloras' students. And this led to Cosimo's acceptance of Platonism. And so began the interest of the Medici in Plato. The next stage of the Platonic revival came with those ecumenical councils, this is in the 1430s and 1440s, which were for many years, they're in different places, but for many years they convened in Florence. One Gemistos Plethon arrived with the Eastern delegation in 1438. He brought with him the complete works of Plato. It must have been a big pile. He stayed in Florence and taught Greek language and Platonic philosophy. Plethon held extreme views where others tried to blend Plato with Aristotle. He made a sharp distinction. He even rejected Christianity for a perennial or universal philosophy that precedes Christianity. And this notion of one united perennial wisdom found in all traditions took off like wildfire in the Renaissance. Gemistos Plethon's students, Italian and Greek, were very influential in spreading the Platonic. Oh, here he is here. He's in a little picture here. So Plethon's students were very influential in spreading the Platonic attitude to science through Western Europe. Another Platonist involved with the Ecumenical Council was the famous German Platonic philosopher, considered to be the founder of German philosophy, Nicholas of Cusa. Nicholas actually travelled with a delegation to Constantinople in 1437. The purpose was to bring back a high-level Byzantine delegation back to Italy. But while in Constantinople, Nicholas took the opportunity to seek out Platonic philosophers. He brought back to Italy a manuscript of Proclus's Platonic theology. Says it all. Two of Plethon's students, also at the council of Florence, were very important to the revival. They were Blessarion, a Greek Platonist who became a Catholic cardinal. There's a story in him. And John Agiopoulos. Remember John Agiopoulos? I mentioned him earlier. he was a tutor to Lorenzo de' Medici. But earlier, he also taught Marsilio Ficino. Ficino founded the Platonic Academy of Florence. By this time, many translations had already been done, but under Cosimo's instructions, Ficino made a complete translation of Plato's dialogues, finishing in 1469. By this time, newly invented movable type printing presses were available, and so the works of Plato were printed at great expense to Cosimo and distributed widely at the close of the 15th century. And so it began. And this is how money, Medici, and the Ottoman invasion brought mathematical mysticism to the West as midwife to modern mathematical science. From the middle of the 15th century, interest in geometry and arithmetic awakened. Then mathematical astronomy, physics, architecture, and engineering. And in most cases, the Platonic motivation is most plainly evident. In Galileo, in Kepler, and on into the 17th century in Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And also Descartes and Newton and others. We're not saying that they were Platonists per se, only that they had this Renaissance attitude to science. They saw the mathematical forms of nature as traces of the divine creation. This attitude came from Platonism. And so, this is how we can see that at first sight, what seems incredible. How these orthodox theologians, arriving from the besieged Eastern Empire, sparked a revival of mathematical philosophy, a revival that would lead on to the mathematical sciences and technology that continues to shape our world today. Okay, am I to take questions? Oh, here we go. All right.
Thank you, Bernie. I couldn't help smiling right through that because I was learning so many new things. Nikos has got a question for you, but Nico, I'm going to get in first. I'm going to indulge myself.
That's your privilege.
But I'll take yours next. Thank you. That was fantastic. And as I said, I was smiling right through it because I realised there was so little. I know so little about the topic, but that made me enthusiastic because I thought there's so much to learn.
We should know this, shouldn't we?
Yeah. But thanks for making the connection between things like philosophy and science and maths about other things. The topic of mathematical mysticism, and especially also your reference to Andrea Palladio at the end, brought to mind geometric designs in pottery for me. And I know I'm harking back to the Hellenistic period, and that's not what you specifically talked about tonight, but indulge me. So I'm going back way before the 5th century, before Common Era. And I'm thinking, if we consider art to be an expression of being in the world, could we think of this design scheme on pottery, say from 700 before Common Era, to be, could that have prompted a mathematical approach by philosophers to reason and logic. I mean, these people were drawing these circles and lines that you refer to long before the Platonists came along, really. And that gap interests me. The foundation of mathematics, I suppose I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, I mix in many circles, but one of the circles I mix in talks about sacred geometry, and in those circles, this interest in geometry is considered to just go back forever, as far as we can find, and even to the Neolithic, to the Stone Age, and so on. You see it in design going right back. And so there has been interest in geometry, and interest in geometry as sacred, and also as is expressed in nature, going back as far as we can tell, as far as there are records.
So when could we identify when a spark happened where people want to explain these forms in a mathematical sense as an explanation?
Well, there's a story that is told by the Greeks, told by Plato, which seems to be reasonably true, as far as we know, is that the Egyptians started working with geometry to build their pyramids, also started working with geometry especially because they had this problem of the flood every year, and they had to resurvey their land after the flood had gone through. And that's when they started investigating basic geometric relationships and that sort of thing. So using numbers to analyse geometry, as in Pythagoras' theorem and many other things. And so this is a story that Plato tells, but yeah, and we don't know other schools, but the Pythagoreans took up geometry and took it up as a sacred religious sort of practice, a religious investigation in the 5th century BC. We don't actually know whether Pythagoras even did any mathematics. Don't tell people that, they don't like to hear that. But in the 5th century they did, and they did it in this particular way that that then really took off. And so, but other traditions, they might be lost.
Okay, I'll hand it over to Nico now.
Thank you very much, Bernie. That was an excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. Very accessible, very clear, and very wide-ranging. I totally agree with how you ended with your little swipe at Stephen Greenblatt's claims, which I agree with. However, I'm a little bit less comfortable with your sort of, and I wasn't 100% clear whether you were making this claim or not, so maybe you could clarify this, but the relationship between Christianity and wisdom, and the way in which, in fact, there's a certain tendency in the Christian faith to wanting to colonise everything that comes before it and after it. And the way in which I'd like you to tackle the relationship between Christianity and wisdom, because I have no problem with the associations you make between mysticism, theology, and what I call cosmology, right? No problem there. But let's take the example of Cardinal Bessarion, who you mentioned, who changes religion. He comes as one of those ambassadors, as an Orthodox representative, becomes a Catholic. Now, he was a scholar as well, a student of Themistocles Platon, and also his personal library is the foundation of Venice's state library today. So he's an enduring influence of humanist thought in that place. Now, my question to you is, through examples like Bessarion, maybe the attachment to religion was a matter of convenience, especially institutional dogma was something that they were least comfortable, but it was a matter of convenience in order to pursue deeper theological, cosmological thinking, which included mathematics and philosophy. So that's my question. How significant is the actual institution of the church for this kind of thinking?
I could probably come back to you and say, Constantine the Great, did he really believe Christianity? I mean, it's really hard to kind of get inside people's heads, isn't it, to decide whether it was for convenience or not. But I could probably talk a little bit about Christian exclusivism, and then about the ethos of the period. So with Christian exclusivism, you certainly don't see that in the ante-Nicene church fathers. It's more it's much more closer to a universalism. But like if you look at Eusebius' history of the church, he does say Christianity is old as creation, and you do get that in Paul's letters as well, that it is Christianity. So it's kind of like saying, well, this wisdom that you find elsewhere must be Christian. And there was a lot of work, especially after the Nicene, well, especially after the 6th century, exclusivism, closing down the schools and all that sort of thing. So there is a strong tenet of exclusivism going right through the tradition. So that's certainly there. But it's easy to flip over, isn't it? It's easy to say there's a perennial wisdom tradition that appears in all schools, that is beyond Christian, is something more fundamental than Christian. So in a way, perhaps it's a name or it's a political name for what you're talking about. And so in the Renaissance, when you read these guys, it's so clear that they are into this thing, where if it's in Egypt, whether it's Egyptian, whether it's Babylonian, whether it's Mohammedan, whatever it is, if it's true, it's Christian, or if it's true, it's the perennial philosophy. And they see it appearing again and again. And a fantastic late example of that is when the Jesuits went to China. I don't know whether people know this story, but it's a great story where this was right around 1700, so right at the Enlightenment basically, and they got into trouble because of this. But they thought, well, you know, the story was get to China, get into the court. They converted Constantine the Great. What if we convert the Chinese emperor? And so they decided, we can bring Christian science, right? Christian science, because Western astrology was considered to be Christian. We can bring that, impress them with that, and the mathematics as well, and then convert him. And so they sent a mathematical mission over. They sent mathematicians over to the court to hope to convert people in the court and therefore convert the emperor. These guys started reading the old texts. They started reading the old texts in the I Ching with the yin and yang and all that, and went right down and were reading the old script. And they said, these guys are already Christian. They're already Christian. And they were writing back and saying, this is already Christianity. And so they had to tell a story, and they would always tell these stories. But this one had to go right back, because China had this really long story of civilization going right back. And so the mythical, they had a date for the mythical first emperor of China. He was a foreigner. And so they said he was a son of Noah. So it was this Noahide theory, and then they could incorporate it into Christianity. But of course it didn't work, because then things started to change, and it's sort of, you couldn't have that attitude to science or foreign religions anymore. But the Jesuits were pushing that, Leibniz was pushing that, and Leibniz found his binary mathematics in the yin and yang of it's on the Taiwanese flag, I think, the yin and yang of the trigrams. So this is what was going on. And if you read all this science and this is what is happening, we're looking for Christianity or whatever you want to call it. And for them, maybe they had to have cover. Maybe they had to pretend. Maybe they weren't even Christian. You know, you've got Newton. Newton didn't become a priest. He should have become a priest. I don't know if people know this story. He didn't become a priest because he went back and read the early Greek fathers and saw that they'd got the Trinity story wrong. He was on Arius' side. I don't know whether people know about the Arian controversy. Secretly, he kept that hidden. Right? He had a colleague who got sacked from his chair when he was found out to be anti-Trinitarian. He kept it hidden. So people were keeping things hidden, and we don't really know ultimately, do we, what people were thinking.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from a gentleman here, and then we'll take some that have come through online. Bernie.
Thank you, Bernie. That was a very interesting lecture. Always nice to see an alternative view to the given. My question is not unrelated to Nick's. You mentioned both Giordano Bruno and Galileo. Their demise is an interesting case. Could you talk about how and why they were both treated the way they were from the church, if their understanding and what they were promoting was in line with the church?
Oh, was in line with the church.
Well,
okay. Yeah.
That's what I understood. I may have misunderstood.
No, okay. So the first thing I do want to say is the reasons why Galileo got into trouble and the reasons why Bruno got into trouble are both controversial in the scholarship. And so I don't really want to go into that. I'm not an expert. So people may not know, but Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600. He was a scientist. He was a theologian. He was a classic Renaissance scientist. He certainly wasn't. He wasn't an Epicurean, but in this book he is. You know, it's so weird. Okay, so I really won't speak to that. Why they got into trouble, people can go and have a look at the controversy, you know, about why people think that they got into trouble. But I will perhaps iron out a misunderstanding. All I'm really saying is that in their heads, Ficino, all these people, in their heads, that they didn't feel. A lot of them seem to, from their writing. In their heads, they didn't feel a conflict with their Christianity. They didn't feel that it had been challenged, mostly. It was in accord with it. Go and read Augustine. Go and read Origen. Go and read Justin Martyr. You go and read them, and you can't see any challenge to your Christianity. So they didn't see any challenge. But, oh my God, the church, that political institution of the church, you had to deal with that. And the church had to deal with trying to have a dogma and everyone agreeing with the dogma. And so various things went on in its relationship to science and various attitudes to science. And so I mentioned two big ones, which was when they started the universities in the 11th and 12th century, and they brought in Aristotle. You know, was it convenient or was it something that they thought they could work with? I think there was a symbiotic relationship here because Aristotle, they could put Aristotle in a corral. They could have a theology in the Bible, they could have a revealed religion and natural philosophy that is atheistic. And so the irony is that the science that the church could tolerate at that time was atheistic science. When you get to the Renaissance, it becomes so dangerous because people go and look at the Trinity and the history of the Trinity story. Oh my God, you know, and they go and look at, read their Platonism and stuff. Oh, all this church dogma that they tried to pin down at Nicaea, that they tried to pin down at all the other councils, was all getting challenged. And people were saying, as they had in the Middle Ages and quickly got burned at the stake, God is within. I am becoming divine through my research, through my science, through my philosophy, in a Platonic sense. And that's a big challenge to the church that wants to have all the authority and power, the spiritual authority of the church coming through its priests, through its institutions and through its dogma. It happened with Sufism in Islam as well. Yep.
I just have a backup question to that.
Yeah.
Then you're saying that the influence of the East is what gave. I'll just repeat it. You're saying that the influence of the East is what gave the big impetus to science in the West through the Renaissance, or what?
The mathematical sciences, or I'll narrow the claim to the mathematical sciences.
But given what you've just said now in answer to my previous question, wouldn't it be the case that science would be better suited and be able to develop much more effectively if it played along with the church in the way that you just described, Aristotelian science, atheistic science is what you called it? Why would we get such an influence from the East if it wasn't going to be helped by the established church and the establishment?
Okay, well, I'll throw a question back to you then. Why didn't mathematical sciences develop in the High Middle Ages, in the 11th and 12th centuries? They developed after this revival of Platonism. They developed when these texts came across, when all this mathematical philosophy came, all linked with Platonism. So the reason that it developed...
But the elements wasn't linked to Platonism, was it?
Yes, it was. It was linked to Platonism because it was linked to mathematics. And Proclus wrote his commentary on it, and it was very strongly linked with Platonism in the revival. All mathematics was linked with Platonism in the revival, whatever they got. And the mathematical sciences before that were so derelict, were not taught very well and taught in very primitive ways. And it wasn't until the middle of the 15th century that people really started getting into it and working it out, getting taught it, and it was all in the context of the Platonic attitude, because it was, if we can work out, you know, they use the key, you know, another one's the key. If you can unlock the formal nature of creation, if we can work out how God did this, we know he did it in a mathematical way because we're Platonists, how God did this, then we can unlock the secrets of the universe and we can become closer to God. So I'm saying that motivated them, that got them going. And we should also note that it took a long time, even after the Royal Society was established in England, a very significant event, right? The Royal Society was established in the late 17th century. Science, people couldn't see the practical use of science. They tried to push it, people couldn't see it. It took a long time for people to see the practical side of it. We just presumed that we could see it. You couldn't see it in Galileo. You know, you had Leonardo with all his great inventions and everything, but people just couldn't see how valuable it was in the way that we see it. And so this motivation, this theological motivation, this motivation to become divine in yourself, to get this wisdom, I'm saying this is what drove science. And this came in a large part thanks to these emissaries these theologians coming from the East and reintroducing Platonism, Platonism, the connection between philosophy, between the mysticism and the mathematics, which you see in people like Proclus, which you see in Archimedes, which you see in other writings.
Great. Bernie, I've got a question from Savas Irgouropoulos, sorry. Can we therefore say that ancient Greek philosophy gave dignity to Christianity?
Oh, okay. Gave dignity to Christianity. That sounds a bit loaded, doesn't it? Scientific dignity, maybe. Look, mathematics or Platonism, what was it?
Can we therefore say that ancient Greek philosophy gave dignity to Christianity?
Okay, well look, maybe how I'll answer that is that it fleshed it out. And you can see this in the early history of church. We're actually doing Platonism and Christianity now, of course, about this. So go and look at the Gospels. What's in the Gospels? You know, that's the new stuff. Let's leave the Jewish text for a moment. In the Gospels, is there a theology? Is there a theory of God? Is there something consistent telling you who God is and about the creation? There's a lot that is left out. Is there stories about the soul and the soul's afterlife and reward and punishment? A lot is left out, and it required filling out, and we see it getting filled out by the church fathers, the Platonic church fathers, especially those in Alexandria. So we're talking about Origen, and then also much later, and important for the West, because he was writing in Latin, was St. Augustine. So I don't know about dignity, but it certainly fleshed it out, and it did give it its theology. It's from Platonism, Stoicism as well, which came from Platonism. The Trinity comes from the Platonic debate. And how important is the Trinity? It's the God. It's the worshipped God.
And we've got a question from Maki Mu, who says, Bernie, you distinguished between the study of Platonism and that of the language of Plato. How do you distinguish between the two? Indeed, can you study one without the other?
Oh, okay. We are studying ancient Greek at the Platonic Academy, but not with Plato, with the early Greek philosophers before him. Well, can you distinguish the two? I suppose that means if I read Plato in English translation, am I really reading Plato? Well, towards this audience, maybe there's a few purists here who would say I'm not. I think you can distinguish the two. Yes, you can. You can do translation. Translation is possible, definitely. So what was important here is these guys had the language. Their church language was about the 4th century, and so a bit closer to ancient Greek, the ancient Greek of Plato. And so they had a strong connection with that language. And so they were able to do good translations and help other people do good or better translations.
Okay. And I'm aware of time, but we've got one last question from Maria Rukakis. Could you please comment on the Middle Eastern scientists? Was there a contribution in the Renaissance? Where do they fit in the timeline?
Okay, that is a good question because I did leave that out. Yes. So, as people might know, when the schools closed in the 6th century, in Alexandria and in Athens, they were the big two centres of learning and philosophy. When they closed, some of the teachers did go east, and in the 8th century and the 9th century in Baghdad and then in other places, there was a Arabic or Persian, there's a controversy there, Arabic Renaissance. Okay, so then it's from them that a lot of texts came during the Middle Ages, especially through the south of Spain, Andalusia, to Toledo, and there were translations that were done there, including a little bit of Plato, but mostly Aristotle. In terms of what happened in the Renaissance, mostly it was these texts coming directly from Greece, so from Constantinople, in the Greek, and direct translations that really got things going. Some of the translations that came from the Arabs were translations of translations, so they went to Arabic and then they went into Latin. And some of them also were translations of translations of translations. So it was a bit problematic. But the Arabic sources weren't so important in the 15th century for Platonism.
Great. I think it's nearly 8:30, so thank you, Bernie, once again for a fascinating lecture, and I know I've got to read more on everything you spoke about tonight.
All right,
Thanks
for having me
Thank
here.
you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a note about next week's seminar. It's an online event only. It's titled The Past, Present and Future of Mythologia in Epirus. It will be delivered by Christopher C. King, who's an ethnomusicologist, writer, producer and advocate of traditional music. So please join us next week and go down and do some courses at the Academy.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Oh, good. Oh, good.